Now, my attachment to our grand project, really, of trying to get some reality to the global warming and net zero argument, I've been part of this since about 2008. So, which gives you an idea. I started my uh, Brexit sort of battle. I don't know what your thoughts are on Brexit in the room, but I started that, I suppose, around about the Maastricht Treaty in 1992 and managed to have that referendum 24 years later. So by my reckoning on this campaign, having started this in 2008 or been with it since 2008, we may be complete by 2032, so not too far. I'm actually hoping it might be a little bit quicker, because just today we've had Tony Blair come out somewhat skeptical about the whole project, and his words are these: doomed to fail. That sound of that, which I think we've known that for a while. But the one that was tucked away was, it's riven with irrationality. Now, on the same week that we have dear Ed Miliband's Department for Energy Security and Net Zero willing to spend £50 million on attempts to dim the sun, not quite sure how that matches with a desire to have solar panels, but let's not sort of split hairs here. I think we're on the side of angels with this campaign, not because we know we're right, it's because what Britain is doing is uniquely stupid. Now, if there is a climate change issue, and there is an if about some of that, but if there is a net zero issue and a problem, it seems to me a lot of the solutions that are being found are more dangerous than the problem we're trying to solve. You only have to look at the issue of burning virgin wood pellets in Drax power stations, and that's called net zero, to make you realize that this whole project is not just flawed, it's quite frankly stupid. But an aspect of this, which we get thrown every scare at us: we're going to run out of water, we're going to run out of energy, we're going to run out of just about everything, and it's all to do with climate change and net zero. And the one that we hear a lot of is food, that we've got a food problem. Now, I'm very pleased this evening, fellow members, we have got a specialist in this very topic, in Karl Iver Dahl-Madsen. I do love these Danish names. We have such boring short names, don't we? He's a Danish chemical engineer. He's an author, an environmental strategist with a career spanning aquatic ecological modelling. Love to see that spreadsheet. You must get your fingers wet. Yeah. Aquaculture innovation and agricultural policy. And in the 1970s, he helped pioneer mathematical models of the aquatic environment, leading to the promotion of recirculating aquaculture systems in Europe. He's well known and well respected in Danish research institutions, including the Danish Hydraulic Institute and the National Aquaculture Organization. But the one that is of interest to us, and we don't even need to know Danish to understand this, is Karl is a founding voice in klimarealisme. And I think even in Danish, that has got the Ron seal, what it says, what it does in the tin, holds very true. And that's a Danish initiative, very similar to us here in the GWPF, to promote realism and proportionality in climate debates. And his current interest is on food systems. And that's exactly what he's going to speak to us tonight about global warming, the whole climate policy and food. So really pleased that we can see another dimension, demolished no doubt, of one of those fear factors that we've all got far used to. So Karl, you're amongst great friends this evening. Thank you for being with us.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for this very kind introduction. I have to say that I think we Danes can compete with the British in stupidity. We are doing as best as we can. And I gave this similar lecture to this at the Scandinavian Climate Realist Conference last autumn, and Benny was listening in, and he proposed that I should give it here because you English are as interested in food as everyone, and you are anyway fed by the Danish. I mean, we are producing your bacon and so on. So that's fine. Actually, the Danes are producing about 3 times more food than they consume. So we are doing well for the food security of the world. So you have heard some of the introductions, but I would like to say that even if I'm semi-retired, I still work actively. I'm part of the board of directors of a major Danish fish farming company, and I have been, as mentioned, president of the Danish Fish Farmers Association, and I have also been chairman of the Danish Organization for Future Studies. You know, in climate science, there's a lot of well-meaning futuristic stuff. Much of it is rubbish because these guys don't know the history. Future science is a historic discipline. If you don't know the history, you can't say any useful things about the future. Let me get started. My road to climate realism was actually Julian Simon, because in 1970, I was asked from the Danish foreign minister to go to Thailand to educate environmental engineers in water environment. And I thought I had to educate myself about global issues, because I couldn't talk to these people if I didn't do that. So I started by, among other, reading Julian Simon. And he showed very clearly, with something which is true today, that the world is getting a steadily better place, however you look at it. Of course, there are many downsides and things are not going so well, but generally it's up and up. And he said many nice things about that. And then I studied these things also at Asian Institute of Technology, and I made a small paper with the Vietnamese scientist about climate change. And it's actually nearly the same thing I think about the issue today. I was a little bit more uncertain at that time if there was a human influence or not. I think there is a human influence. How big it is very, you can argue a lot about that. It's very inaccurate, but at least I would say there is the human influence. But the second thing, which we also concluded in our paper, was that the cure is worse than the disease. And I still stand firmly by that. Not even worse, much, much worse. So I also had a very nice experience learning an Indian professor, Gajendra Singh. He was a very nice person and knew a lot about stuff. Actually, he became vice agricultural minister in India for a while. But he also told me that when he was a young engineer, he went to California and he met Paul Ehrlich. You probably all know this infamous guy who tells that we will be starving all the time, and the British would be starving, and everybody would be starving all the time. And this young engineer, Gajendra, he went up to Paul Ehrlich and said, no, it's not true that India is starving. We are producing so much food now that we export food. And Paul Ehrlich, what did he say? That's not true, because I know something else. But I come from India, this guy. Yeah, it's just, I mean, but this is the case. You all know these very, very people who are very secure of themselves, even if the facts are fully different. Now let me walk you very briefly through what happens to the world. We know the temperature has increased a little bit more than a degree, and the water levels had increased about 30 centimeters in the last 100 years. 4 times more people. Infant mortality has decreased 100 years from 22 to 4%. We have life expectancy from 35 to 72 for the global. It's a lot. It's a doubling in 100 years. Wealth, 8 times more wealth, real wealth per capita in income. Poverty from 70% for 100 years ago down to below 10%. It's absolute poverty. I know it's a very low level, but still it's a huge progress. And education, we have much more educated people. And Simon's Abundance Index shows us that we have much more resources now than we had at that time. It looks counterintuitive, but it's not because of human knowledge and ingenuity. We can use resources better and better. And energy, we have more energy. Farming is a very important field here, and the farming yields have increased a little bit less than 4 times over this century. And the malnutrition has gone down from 65% of all human beings being malnourished to below 7%. Still too much, but a huge progress. Now, a very naive person could say, this must be because the temperature has increased 1 degree and because the water level has increased 30 centimeters. But we all know that's completely rubbish. What it really shows is that climate change doesn't mean anything real for human progress. It's just a minor factor. I'm not saying it's completely zero, but it's a minor factor compared to the major factor, which is our brains, our innovation abilities. That's what counts. Now let's look at food. So we will have more food forever. In the words to forever is a long term, but anyway, we will have more food. And the primary reason for how much food is produced is not weather or technology, it's actually demand. Food is so important that if people demand it, it will be produced. So the only way you cannot produce enough is if people are too poor to buy the food, but else it's demand. And efficiency and cost is increasing all the time, the yields per area and so on. So we have increasing production, increasing yields, and decreasing costs. And again, climate change is marginal compared to these developments. And my future estimate is that we will have all the food we can ever eat, and it will be steadily cheaper and will have a steadily lower impact on the environment. Let's look at the total numbers. This is the value of the total agricultural production of the world. It's a little bit more than $4 trillion. And it's actually declining a bit if you look at it relatively, in the way that it means less and less in comparison to the total gross domestic product of the world. And some people use that as saying, yeah, we don't need farming, but we do, because we need to have food. It's just a question that other things like services and manufacturing and other stuff is relatively getting more and more important. It's also a saturation thing. We cannot eat more than we can eat. We look at production quantities. We look at meat production. People are saying we should eat less meat. That is not happening. The meat production is increasing tremendously, and it will still increase tremendously because people are getting richer and they want better food, healthier food, and they can afford it. And we see the change in cereal production has surpassed the rate of population change, so we get more and more well-fed. If we look at fisheries and aquaculture, which is my specialty, it's not so much, but still $0.5 trillion totally, where aquaculture is 2/3 of the value. So it's getting more and more important. It's because the aquaculture products are generally more expensive, simply because it makes no sense to use much money to grow an inexpensive product. So it's salmon and shrimp and such things which are grown. And so we are getting well fed. And my estimate or valuation is that there is no excuse for hunger. Hunger is not something which should be possible in a world which can produce all the food we need. When it happens anyway, there's a Norwegian poet who said it, if you have starvation, and it's because of deceit, it's because you have bad governance, you have bandits who are robbing you. That's why. But you still have the endless whining by like the Paul Ehrlich types and all of them. And I'm a happy person, and my wife and I, we are happy persons. But if we had been doomsayers instead of doomslayers, we could have been rich. Because that what happens with Mr. Ehrlich and these guys. They perpetually continue to say things which are obviously wrong, but they sell huge amount of books and get huge amount of money for lecturing. Crazy. Now, what we see in the real world is the tripling of food production, and even if there are still some malnourished peoples, it's not at all because of lack of food. It's simply because of bad governance. You can see the extreme examples like North Korea, but there are many other examples. What we see is another kind of malnutrition problem. That's as big as the too little food problem. That's the too much food problem. Obesity is increasing much in our part of the world, and that's bad. Personally, I think it's much to do with eating refined foods like too much sugar and starch and so on, and too little meat. But that's controversial, but that's what I think about it. And I think that, again, this doesn't show that there's lack of food, at least. Now, food is also, as I mentioned, something which you have to have. You can't survive without food. Means that the elasticity of staple foods like grain and rice and so on are high. You just have to pay what you can pay. But if you make luxury foods like organic strawberries, then they will fall away with the problems with food production. Again, to state it very clearly, the primary driver for food production is demand. And demand is there because we have a population growth. Now we can see the latest forecasts actually say that it will level out at the end of this century, and probably we will begin to fall. I'm not too happy with that. I think personally that it's a bad thing if we have a declining population. Stagnant would be fine, but declining is not so good. And furthermore, we have a huge economic growth. So these two things will mean that there will be more demand and also more demand for better food, particularly meat. And we see that high quality food like meat is in demand. We see it in aquaculture. And we can see that the meat supply is very dependent, of course, of the gross national income per inhabitant. So there's a more or less linear relationship. The more rich you are, the more meat you eat. So the idea of saying that we should solve climate issues, but by forcing people to eat less it's a fantasy. Will not happen. Cannot happen. We have, as I said, increasing efficiency and decreasing costs. The cereal production is increasing. The crop yields are increasing tremendously. And that's a fantastic thing. If everybody in the world had the same efficiency yield as a Danish farmer, then we could reduce the global area for agriculture with 50%. And that's with existing technologies. Nothing fancy, just existing technologies. Let's go a bit more into detail. Here you can see on the left, this is the wheat yields in several areas of the world. The upper curve is the Danish wheat yields, which are high, up to 8 tons per hectare. On the middle, the white, that is the European the EC average, which are somewhat lower, and then again the world average, which are half of the Danish. That's why I say if you can use the Danish methods, you can double or you can reduce agricultural area. Another interesting thing is that the variation of the three curves are very different. If you look at the Danish, it's varying a lot. If you look at E, it's varying less, and at the world, it's varying a little, varying very little. And that's because we trade a lot of agricultural products, and that's always a good harvest one place, maybe a bad harvest in another place. That's why I will come into that a little bit later, but one of the worst things you could do for food security is tariffs. It's trade wars. That's absolutely something of the worst you can do. To eat locally is to live dangerously. The real food prices do not increase. And if you look at the very long run for wheat prices, you can see that they were just going up very up and down for many, many centuries, actually. But then in the late beginning of the 1800s, they started falling a lot because we got mechanization and we got fertilization and so on and so on. So now they are quite low. They can still go up and down much, but compared to earlier, they're quite low. So somebody are also discussing that we human beings are appropriating lots of the photosynthesis products of the world. But what they do not see here is that we human beings, we can actually influence the productivity. The productivity is finally guided by the amount of sun coming into the plants, but there's a lot of intermediates like fertilizer and water and so on. So we can increase the productivity of the earth a lot. We do that by fertilizing. We are increasing the fertilizer circulation, so it's doubled for nitrogen as it should be. And then we can increase the yield a lot. If we look at slash and burn agriculture, which is the original form of agriculture, it was much below 1 ton per hectare. But again, if we do modern technology, I told you a good Danish farmer would make 10 tons per hectare. A good Iowan farmer in the United States would be able to do 30 tons of corn per hectare. And if we do seaweeds, which again is my specialty, we can do much more because the exciting things about seaweed, you can use the whole plant. If you have a plant on land, it's only some of the part of the plant. For grain, it's only the little part which is the grain. And if it's beets or tubers, you can use more because they have a much more eatable stuff in them. That's one of the reasons why you should look more at potatoes and tubers, because they have a yield which is maybe 5 times higher than grain because of this. And anyway, if we look a little bit futuristic, we can have any yield if we have cheap energy. Infinite amount of cheap energy would also mean that the yield would go very high. One exception to all this stuff is, of course, poverty. If people are poor, they can't do anything. And that's why I'm personally not happy with all this green transition stuff, because it just means that you take away the most necessary factor for human beings to be rich. That's cheap energy, cheap, secure energy. I think it's irresponsible and also unethical to do that. So we already have proven technologies which can do the things I've showed you here. We have fertilizer, we have mechanization, we have pesticides. I call it the nanotechnological hoe, because many people are don't like pesticides. I'm a chemist myself, so I don't mind. But people, they say, yeah. But anyway, it's just, if you look at it from a nanotech perspective, it's just going into the plant or animal which you want to get rid of and cutting off certain circuits, and then it's gone. Very smart. Genetics. I don't know if you know how a corn plant looks originally. It's so big. So big. The original corn plant, and now it's so. So all the food we eat in the world has nothing to do with what nature originally gave us. But still people, we shouldn't change nature. We do it all the time, and if we didn't, we wouldn't survive. Then the genetic modified organisms. I just yesterday made a blog post about a special oil plant in Norway and Denmark, which now have been genetically modified to make the right omega-3 fatty acids, which is a very scarce resource because you only get it from fish, and there's only a limited amount of fish. But now we are beginning to make plants into organisms which can produce this kind of omega-3, and then we get rid of that scarcity. And mariculture, of course, if we culture the oceans, we have more or less infinite amount of land and also infinite amount of water. But then also one of one of the things I don't like very much is this organic farming issue, because it's what I call harmful retrotech. It doesn't do any good for anything. You can argue that you can have an organic food which tastes better because it's grown slower, and there could be some reason to that. But you can do that with conventional farming too, and you can do it cheaper and with less impact. The big and bad impact of organic farming is that it uses too much space. And you can't have a lot of nature and biodiversity if you use space for farming. If we made away with fertilizers and pesticides, we could only produce about half of what we are producing now. So you can imagine what would happen to the world if we did that. Sri Lanka did that experiment for a couple of years ago, and revolution occurred. And we can do it in very rich countries like Denmark and Great Britain and so on. We can do it. And anyway, if we look at what people actually are eating, then they say most of them say they want to eat organic, but when you look into what they actually buy at the supermarkets, not so much. At least in Denmark, it has more or less stagnated now. The organic area is beginning to fall. And the only thing which keeps it up is the politicians. And that's the same with the green transitions, you would say. The politicians made a mistake. That's okay. Everybody makes mistakes, but they don't want to admit that they have made a mistake. We are seeing now peak agricultural land. That is that even if we have to feed more and more people, it is outmaneuvered by our ability to increase yields. So we will gradually go towards a lesser and lesser use of areas for agriculture, which is a good thing. I'm much in favor of having space for nature and biodiversity. That's a good thing for everything. And it will happen, except if some crazy politicians try to enforce backwards-looking agricultural methods. If we look at the sign on climate change on agriculture, it's very difficult to see any. As I said, it follows demand and not weather, and we have a global supply chain. If we lose that, then we could have trouble. And farmers adapt. One of the things I hate about the IPCC and other reports about this stuff is that they don't really include adaptation. At least if they have adaptation, the emergence with non-adaptation, which makes no sense because sane people will adapt. I mean, there seems to seem that a farmer is like a poor sod who stands and looks at his plant, which is drying out because of no water, and he does nothing. Just let it go. Of course, farmers do a lot. They know they can adapt very quickly because it's only 1 year crops, most of them. In Denmark, we have included maize or corn in our food production because for about 20, 30 years ago, it got warm enough in Denmark so we could grow maize, which we are doing. And now it's stagnated because it's not getting that much warmer. But that's adaptation for you. And again, as I already have mentioned, we have a huge potential. The upside is huge, so there's lots of room for improvement. And I have to cite one of your countrymen because he said something which is very clever. On what principle is it that with nothing but improvement behind us, we are to expect nothing but deterioration before us? I mean, that's exactly what it's about. And that's mid-1800s, he said that. We will look at what can climate change do. It can, of course, if it gets warmer, what will happen? Here I have made 3 curves for wheat, for maize, and for rice. And of course, this is very general, but it's still the most important crops. And they all have this kind of optimal curve. It's a slowly increasing yield up to a maximum level, and then there's a rapid downfall if the temperature gets too high. And you can see that's for all of them. But if you take the curve, if you adapt and move production from one species to the other, you see this kind of curve, which it has an optimum about 30 degrees. And I would say that it would be quite difficult to get to 30 degrees average in the world. That would not be possible. So there's very slow risk, and I did the complete calculation. We need to go up to about 6 degrees above industrial temperatures before we could see a temperature influence on the crops of the world. So it's not an immediate issue. And anyway, if you have enough water, it's not an issue at all. That's why rice is so good a crop to grow in tropical areas, because if you have water, it thrives. The higher temperature, the better. Of course, drought could be an issue, but we don't see it. You all know the measurements, the observations. They don't tell you anything about droughts increasing in general. Of course, you see areas in the world where the droughts are increasing, but you see other areas where the wetness is increasing. So it equals out. And that you would see even if there was no climate change at all. You would always have areas where something goes up and something goes down. So that's not to say that it couldn't be later on. But again, I'm a bit skeptical about things that you say will happen, but you can't see it in the data that it's happening. Precipitation is increasing, though, but that's generally the good thing, but not flooding, which would be a bad thing here. And anyway, if we look at that, people look at the Dutch. I mean, 1/3 of Holland is below sea surface, and they don't seem to be much harmed by that. They can do whatever they like, and they have a very, very high agricultural productivity. And our friends in the CO2 coalition have also done a lot of studies about the CO2 influence, and I'm sure there is an influence. It in general will benefit food production, but I also think that it's quite a little effect compared to all the other things I've talked about. it will make the food a little bit cheaper, but it's not a huge effect. But CO2 increases the ability of the plant to use nutrients and to use water and so on. So it is a good thing. And there's also someone who say that if a plant grows very quickly, it will have less nutrients in concentration. That's true, but it will still have a high concentration of high yield of proteins, higher than if it's not growing fast. So it's not a big deal. But again, I wouldn't overestimate it. I think that's one of the places where we as climate realists have to be careful that we don't like the alarmists to exaggerate things, but we should take care as realists not to make the same mistake. And this is, of course, a huge scandal. Mr. Lombard, who I know quite well, is a part of our advisory board, and he has written a lot about these things. And you said in the introduction to burn wood pellets to get energy. It's worse than stupid. It's criminally stupid. So burn wood to preserve forests. I mean, and biofuels is very bad because the most valuable thing you can grow on a crop on an area of land is food. Food is much more valuable than energy. So you should, of course, try to optimize the area of a useful crop. And the beautiful thing about a plant is that it can actually store its production. It's the only solar catcher which really is worth something. That's the plant. Yeah. But again, this is a huge amount of money, huge damages to many people with this biofuel scandal has been. Then I mentioned North Korea, but there's also a very interesting example for a completely stupid way of managing food production. That's Venezuela. From the point where Mr. Chavez came in power, that's more than 20 years ago, something like that, the Venezuelan plant production has declined with more than 50%. It has nothing to do with climate change, I can tell you, but it's still included if you sum up all things. It's not filtered out for this effect. But and where Venezuelans were very well fed earlier, they are now not so well fed. So that's a human-influenced disaster for food. And if we look back in time, our neighbors in Sweden, they had a very, very bad situation in 1867. 80 to 100,000 Swedes died, and many of them immigrated to United States and Canada and so on. I don't know if you know, there's a famous Swedish television series and also a movie called The Immigrants and the Immigrants. It's highly recommended. It's a very good film. But anyway, at that time, because they couldn't move and there was no room, there was no storage capacity, there was nothing. They just died or had to move. In Denmark, we had a drought in 2018, the worst drought in about 70 years in Denmark. And it caused the agricultural product, the grain production, to reduce with about 23%. It cost a lot of money, but not one Dane died from that. That's the difference between the modern adaptable system. And what's also interesting is that even if it was 23% lower at that specific year, it was still much higher than just 20 years ago. So the increase in yield is so high that even such instances can be coped with. And there were actually some Danish farmers who were smart. They had capacity for irrigating their grain and their corn, and they had record high yields because of the heat. I have some conclusions and some ideas. I will make a few reservations. Gegen Dummheit kämpfen Götter selbst vergeben. We all know that. Stupidity is a bad thing. But we can end the world if we really set our minds to it. I mean, war and nuclear war and other crazy things. And one thing more, which is actually fantastic, that is, we don't need to be perfect to do good. Look at the former century, 2 world wars, 1/3 of the globe in a communist dictatorship, one huge pandemic, the influenza pandemic in the First World War, and still we came out with an enormous increase in welfare and wealth for people on the earth. And I'm happy with that, because if we had to be perfect to do good, we would be dead. So, the future of food will be that we will have all the food we need, and it will give a steadily lower impact. You all know the curves for the carbon intensity. We see a steadily increasing amount of value produced for the amount of CO2 getting emitted. What you may not know is we see the same thing for the Danish nitrogen efficiency. We look at how much a Danish farmer loses from his production compared to the value of his production. You can see this fantastic increase from 100 to 600 over a period of more than 40 years. We have halved our we reduced our nitrogen loss from the production with half, and we have also increased the production value with a lot. So that gives it. And this is just something which happens nearly by itself. I know a lot of people say, no, it's because politicians regulate this and they regulate that. No, it will happen anyway, because a farmer is not so stupid that he buys a kilo of nitrogen for 10 kroner, and so he just, I don't mind if I lost it all. No, he wants to preserve it. So eventually we will get rid of that problem just by itself. The politicians do all kinds of strange and complicated regulations, which actually makes the problem worse than it should be. Now let me give you some futuristic ideas. What can we do? Ocean farming, precision agriculture, animal cell culture, food production in space, and food towers. Just ideas and a little bit of fun, but still you can take it as you feel. I'm, as you can hear, much in favor of oceans. We have 1/3 of the world is water, and there's so much room out there and so much production capacity that we could actually grow all our food in the oceans if we wanted to. And it is getting done. I mean, we have unlimited space, unlimited water, ample supply of nutrients, because there's lots of nutrients just below the surface of the oceans. And if you take an open ocean, it has small variations in salinity and temperature. So ocean sea farming is coming. Norway, they don't. It's not really ocean farming, which is what we call coastal aquaculture. But they produce 1.5 million tons of salmon. That's a lot. And if they go to ocean farming, they can produce all the salmon people would like to eat. And if you have seen the development of salmon, it's now from being a very, very luxury eat, which I had, I couldn't afford in my family when I was a kid. Never ate salmon. Now it's one of the more inexpensive fishes, and even it's still very good. I mean, it's tastes good, it's easy to prepare, and so on. That's what happens when the farmers take over. And then there's the insect-eating craze. There's this strange idea that you should grow insects and eat them because they have a good capacity for converting food into meat. That's true. But what's not known is that it's not better than fish. Fish also has a good capacity for converting food into fish meat. And it's because both of these organisms, they are not warm-blooded animals. They just have the temperature, so they don't need energy for keeping themselves at a certain temperature. That's why they have such a good food efficiency. And so you have to ask yourself, what do you prefer, a smoked salmon or a meal of mealworms? The environmental impact is more or less the same. And there's just recently that you have to be unhappy about that, but there's huge Danish project with an insect factory which is under bankruptcy. And I haven't, for this reason, I never liked the idea, but the other reason is that these insects, they need to get fed, and that's then what's the big deal? What they originally thought was they should use waste, organic waste. But organic, you don't have that much organic waste. And much of it is much polluted. You don't want really to eat an insect who has eaten shit, to say it very directly. So I don't think this is a sane idea. Maybe for some microscopic enterprises there could be some idea. But again, I prefer the smoked salmon or the smoked shrimp anytime. Precision agriculture is just up and coming. I mean, you can water any plant, give it fertilizer with a robot directly to the plant instead of throwing it all over the field. You could use satellites for seeing what is happening. You could use drones. You can do sensors. You can do more or less everything. You have modern Danish cows. They are better monitored than our human beings. I mean, they all wear not watches, but they wear sensors, and you can follow them, whatever they do. So that's one thing, and this is exploding, of course, with the use of AI. Pigs in space is a funny thing. You have all seen these original televisions, but basically, what in space is interesting is that that's always sun. So I'm not saying this will happen tomorrow or even in 100 years, but it could happen. And it's not difficult to take something from space and put it down on Earth. It costs much energy. So there would be infinite amount of room for food production. Then there is animal cell cultures, which is happening. I think it's at least 50 years out in the future before it gets commercially well done. But it is a possibility, and that means that you get rid of all the problems with feeding the bones of and all the other stuff which you don't use from the cow, and you can just produce an infinitely long fish fillet or infinitely long fillet of beef, and you also get rid of the animal welfare problems, which I accept. I mean, I'm not. I think we treat our animals well in agriculture, but you could argue that it would be better if we didn't have them in agriculture. We could find a substitute that would be better. And then, of course, if we have infinite amount of energy, like fusion or even nuclear energy is also more or less infinite, then we could grow plants in high rises. I know it's already happening, but the catch is that it's not economically. It's not good economically because the amount of light costs so much energy and so much money. You can only do it for very special crops. So it's very hyped. I know that urban agriculture and all this stuff, but I'm just saying that it will only really be something at the moment where you can get the light more or less for free, because that's the idea of farming. It's not the field; it's the sunlight. The plant is the perfect sun energy catcher. Yeah, there are some real threats I want to add before the end. And that's, of course, the green transition. That's a real threat to agricultural production because it makes energy expensive and fertilizers expensive. It's not a big deal for rich people like us, but it's a very big deal for the people who already are at a poverty level where they have difficulty affording to buy food. Anti-GMO is also a big issue that doesn't make any sense to me because you can really change things to the better by genetically modifying plants. And now you have this new technique called CRISPR, where you can go in and very, very narrowly do exactly the thing you want with the plant. And this is irrational to be against it, but human beings are irrational, so that's it. And then, of course, the trade restriction is a very, very bad thing, particularly on food. And we have for many, many years already have, it has not been restrictions, but the European and the Americans and the South Americans, they have substituted the agriculture. It's nearly as bad. If we had completely free flow of agricultural products, a lot of African countries, South American countries would benefit, and we would benefit. We would get more and better food. The Danish farmer wouldn't mind. We could not compete with the Argentinians and Brazilians when we should make beef, but we can do most of the rest. We can compete because it's a question of knowledge, and we have much knowledge. Yeah. So my conclusion is that the sane world, a stupid world and something else, but the sane world will never run out of food. We have unlimited production capacity. Climate change will be a minor factor. We can even say that the CO2 will benefit a bit, and the impacts of farming will steadily decrease. And now I have brought my wife Inge, and I will give her the last word if you want to listen in.
Farming's great burden shall lessen each year, as science brings promise and yields without peer. For food in abundance from earth and blue tide, a sane world shall always keep hunger denied. By land and by sea, we'll harvest with glee, unlinked to cruise, or our bounty runs true. The climate may shift, but wise hands shall steer. We move where we must, we reason fulfill.
It's you.